original story was.
Let's take the point Alex was making. Within the confines of the story, Dostoevsky was a great writer. What makes you think the writers of Genesis were a great writer? I mean, who were they? We know nothing about them.
Well, I think they were great writers because I think I understand the patterning of the stories and what it points to. I think the idea, for example, that Cain and Abel are emblematic of two opposed patterns of adaptation to the world is brilliant. It's almost brilliant beyond imagining, especially because the story is so insanely compressed. And it's certainly evident to me as a clinician that the patterns that are portrayed in the story of Cain and Abel play themselves out in the real world continually and terribly, terribly.
You think the author of that story in Genesis was a literary genius?
I think that there's a spirit of literary genius at work across millennia, crafting that story so that it has almost an infinite depth. How that relates to the original author or sequential authors, I don't know, because it's lost in the seeds of time. It's lost in history.
So the story evolved, you're saying the story...
Like a meme.
Yes, well, that's interesting.
It evolved to match the contours of the human memory. That's exactly it, is that these stories, that's part of their archetypal nature. So they have a emotional and motivational expression, but as they propagate across time, they also evolve so they're maximally memorable. And they're maximally memorable for a biological reason.
Well, that's very interesting. If they really did evolve over time, if you could actually trace successive manuscripts, you can't do that. I mean, there's presumably a couple of Hebrew manuscripts and a Greek one. And I mean, what do you mean when you say it evolved?
Well, I would say you can see that in the compilation of the biblical texts, because one of the things that you see evolve, and you criticized the biblical text at one point. Correct me if I've got this wrong, because I don't want to get this wrong. You said that there isn't anything in the biblical text that constitutes, let's say, significant original discovery, which is something that you'd expect if it was of divine providence, let's say, divine provenance. And so, I think, I was thinking about that objection, and I think that one of the discoveries that the text lays bare in an insanely brilliant manner is that the foundation of the community is sacrifice, that's an appropriate conceptualization. And you can see the concept of sacrifice evolve across the biblical texts as they're sequenced chronologically in the overall story that makes up the biblical text. The idea of sacrifice becomes more and more sophisticated. It's more and more elaborated. It's more and more specified. It's more and more embodied. There's an obvious progression in ideas.
The progression, where do you see that progression? In successive manuscripts? Or
It's in the successive stories as the text progresses. The way a novel progresses.
So something like sacrifice in the Old Testament. Sacrifice in the Old Testament.
No, through the
way through to the New Testament.
Text is a sacrificial story as well. The Passion story is a story of sacrifice.
It is
and
indeed.
The sacrificial motif recurs continually through the biblical text, and it's elaborated constantly. And
okay, so